Welcome to Finance Leaders Retirement Insights, the broadcast where we sit down with thought leaders in the world of finance who reveal their unexpected wisdom on the issues impacting retirement.
Welcome to the Finance Leaders Podcast. This is the show where we highlight the stories, insights, and expertise of financial professionals who are making a lasting impact on their clients and in the industry. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dan Nicholson, a financial consultant, author, and a CEO of Nth Degree CPAs. With over 17 years of experience, Dan has built a unique approach to financial consulting that goes beyond the traditional accounting, focusing on financial certainty and strategic growth. His book, Rigging the Game: How to Achieve Financial Certainty, Navigate Risk, and Make Money on Your Terms, is a guide for business owners looking to take control of their financial future. Dan, welcome to the show.
Yeah, super happy to come on today. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Dan, your journey from traditional accounting to creating the Nth Degree approach is fascinating. What was the turning point that made you realize there was a better way to really help business owners around their finances?
Well, I like to tell people that I'm a bit of an accidental accountant, so didn't set out to necessarily work in the finance space. There are a bunch of reasons that caused me to change, but or move into getting an accounting degree. But it could sort of be summarized as the business school had pitched me on how there were more CEOs that had Fortune 500 companies that had an accounting degree at the time than anything else. And I guess that spoke to my ego. And so, like I said, didn't set out, ended up getting nominated for a fellowship at the board that writes all the accounting standards in the US. And so that put me on this whole path. And, but again, I wanted to be an entrepreneur. And so I kept changing jobs. People kept hiring me because of the fellowship, and I'm a Deloitte alum, and the clients I worked on when I was at Deloitte. But it was a me problem. At the time, I wasn't mature enough to realize that it was a me problem. I blamed the company culture, or the job responsibilities, or the lack of upward momentum. But ultimately, I didn't want to have a job. I wanted to be self-employed. And I finally realized after a number of different job changes that I was pretty good at the whole accounting finance thing. And I didn't see in the market 15 years ago that anyone was targeting small business owners with strategic tax advice and more sort of up to CFO level services. Now that's much more commonplace, but 15 years ago, it wasn't at all. And so really, I kind of made that move to kind of marry the skills that I had with what I saw as a market opportunity.
Oh, that's a great story. You mentioned something, accidental accountant. Well, you know what? I work with many financial advisors. I said most financial advisors are accidental business owners or entrepreneurs. And I think that happens even with entrepreneurs because they're thinking, there's a show, I think Nightmare's Kitchen is one of them, and about restaurants. And it's always fascinating when you hear the story of why the owner of the restaurant became the owner. Well, 20 years ago, I was a waitress, and then I decided for retirement, I'm going to open up a business. And I'm like going, that's the wrong thing to kind of thinking about, that just because you were working in a restaurant means you know how to run a restaurant. That's really different. So you talk a lot about achieving financial certainty. What does that mean, and why do you think that most businesses struggle to reach it?
Yeah, well, you probably know this in the finance world, or certainly in the regulated space. It's kind of a taboo to use a word like financial certainty. You're supposed to say things like financial clarity or something that sounds, frankly, just less certain. You're not, financial certainty implies some sort of guarantee. Yeah. And so I kind of set out to try to create my own definition of what does it mean to achieve financial certainty. And I'd heard this equation: anxiety equals uncertainty times powerlessness. Mm-hmm. And it really struck me in that moment. I had just dealt with a bunch of personal anxiety and around this, and I learned that anxiety is sort of this future focused thing. You're worrying about something that might happen, and around the same times, I heard from a CEO of a fairly large financial advisory firm that the essential question that clients are really asking themselves is, am I going to be okay?
Mm.
And it doesn't necessarily matter the total net worth that they have. It's still, as you make more, you have more responsibilities and more people you're taking care of. So that feeling doesn't necessarily go away. And so all that sort of came together. I heard this equation, I was dealing with my own anxiety, and I was hearing this essential question. I realized, well, I could take that equation from Chip Conley and go, not anxiety equals uncertainty times powerlessness. I could say financial anxiety, that fear of am I going to be okay, equals financial uncertainty times financial powerlessness. And so with that, try to figure out, well, how can I give clients more financial certainty and more financial power so that they aren't having so much financial anxiety?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think what it comes down to, and I always tell people, the financial business is not about finances. It has a lot to do with building relationships and also what you just have, really having that peace of mind. And it's more about the way that people feel. They could look at the numbers, but the numbers, they don't really have feelings, but people have feelings about the numbers, depending on what they are. And there is a lot of money stories or even the relationship that people have with money. And speaking for myself on my behalf, I've had, and I'm going to call it kind of a toxic relationship with money because of how I was brought up. I'm originally born in Czechoslovakia, living under communism, things around money, my parents divorced. And that has really impacted me, what happens. And what I find often, people don't go and revisit what are their kind of money scripts or what are their stories around that. And I think that's what creates a lot of uncertainty because their beliefs are, kind of unchecked. Yeah. Now, in your book, Rigging the Game, it's really intriguing title. What kind of inspired you to write it, and what's the kind of the core message you want the readers to take away from the book?
Well, I never thought I was going to write a book. It wasn't something that I had on a bucket list item. In fact, oftentimes when the topic would get brought up by marketers, I would have a very visceral reaction to why I did not want to do that. And but back in around just right before the COVID times, I had a couple of similar to hearing this equation moments of clarity. And one of them was realizing that everything I thought I knew about business, I needed to unlearn to solve or work with small business owners. And it was this uh, goal setting exercise that I went through with this guy named Alan Anderson. And he talked about this framework of first you optimize, then you maximize. It's totally in the context of goal setting.
Hmm.
I was thinking about it, and for some reason it just struck me like, well, in business school, the thing that I learned was to maximize shareholder value. It doesn't matter what degree you take in business school, they're preparing you to go work for a Fortune 500 company and help them maximize shareholder value. And so it's sort of connecting the dots of, okay, well, there's a reason why the conventional uh, reports that I'm giving my small business owner clients aren't resonating with them, because they don't have the resources and tools to maximize. They need to optimize towards what the life that they want, their own definition of wealth. And so I kept pulling at that string, and I started building this operating system of how I would advise my clients differently and build a new set of tools for my CPA firm. And as I was going through that, it became apparent that I had at least a book. And I thought, well, the biggest risk in writing a book is that you spend a bunch of time and no one ever reads it. So I back myself into a corner because I followed one of the principles that I write about in the book called taking micro steps. And there's a series of things that I did that ultimately culminated in pre-selling just around 5,000 copies of the book. And in other words, at that point, I was not literally stuck, but sort of felt like I had enough skin in the game with all the people who had sort of prepaid that I thought I ought to actually do it at that point.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And again, you're kind of sharing some principles and things to do where, yeah, you back yourself there, but again, you pretty well guarantee yourself you're going to go and do it. And again, those are small little things that I think people can do, especially with the, taking, you call it micro step. There was a great book, I think it's Tiny Steps that are called. All of
Mhm.
these things, so often we try to go and make the big step, but we don't realize that, listen, to get on top, when you go in between floors in a building, you don't usually go and take 10 steps at a time. You take one step at a time. You could try to jump, but that creates a lot more risk, when you're on stairs. So I
Mhm.
know in the book you talk about the one concept that's really unique. You talk about financial certainty roadmap. Can you break that down and what that really means and how it differs from, traditional financial planning?
Yeah, and I don't think I fully answered your question around what's the theme of the book, Rigging the Game. So I'll touch on that so I can
Yeah.
answer that question as well. Rigging the game is not about doing anything unethical. It's about how do you get the outcome that you want out of life on your terms. And what I'm advocating for folks is let's get there as fast as possible. That's not novel. Everyone wants to get to their goal as fast as possible. But what I'm advocating for is how can we do it with less effort, actually the least amount of effort, all things considered, the least amount of risk, and ultimately the least amount of obligation. And that somewhat comes from my background working, I mentioned the accounting standard that I worked on. Uh, and first part of my career was in the derivatives and hedging space. So I spent a lot of time thinking about risk and biases. And what I found is that especially in the small business community, it's an epidemic of sorts where the small business owner is redlining on effort. It's like hustle, hustle, hustle.
Mm.
I'm working 80 hours a week. I got my morning routine. I got to get up early. I'm working late, and they're taking maximum risk. So they've been pathologized to believe that they have to bet on themselves and go all in. And the consequence of that is that they have no options. They're just filled with obligations. Every bet that they make has to pay off. And so that's sort of how do we, if we want to do the least amount of effort and the least amount of risk and the least amount of obligation, how do we think differently? Now, I didn't say no effort and I didn't say no risk. Oftentimes for people who I'm working with who are recovering people pleasers and type A folks who are used to getting good grades and crushing every goal, their least amount of effort is still greater than 99% of the rest of the population. It's just all relative to what they're capable of doing versus what they have to do in the situation. So to the question about financial certainty roadmap. So financial certainty for me is getting what you want on your terms without compromise, because I believe the biggest risk in life is not living the life that you want. So get what you want without compromise. So in order to do that, we have to know what you want. So I created a framework called the solvable problem, and it's a method where we're essentially turning your vision board into an equation where we can see what are the additional resources you need to fund all of your goals in the timeline that you've allotted. Most people have not done this exercise. They've done the vision board and they're going to have a six pack and be great parents and own a second house and have a cool car. Uh, but they've never actually done the math to go, well, how much do I actually have to make or earn in the markets to hit that timeline? And until you know that, the actual resources needed, you can't figure out the path with the least amount of effort and the least amount of risk. And so what people do instead is they just go all in and they hustle. And they don't necessarily realize that maybe they've been running in a circle, even though they've gone really fast. So people think about speed. I'm telling people to think about velocity. Velocity is vector, it has a direction, right? So you can go really fast in a circle, but what we actually want is velocity, go fast towards the direction. The direction is the goals, the life that you're trying to fund.
Yeah, you bring a great point. I think a lot of business owners are so focused on a day-to-day operation that they really neglect that strategic, planning or any type of planning, right? So how do you help them to really shift their mindset? Because, at the end of the day, it's really a mindset from going from reactive to proactive planning. How do you help them to really get an understanding of what they need to do?
So I have what I call the four commandments of financial certainty, and you might have picked up a theme that I like to use words that invoke a certain reaction from people. So rigging the game, it's like, oh, what? some people are like, that sounds, I don't want to do that. That's really unethical. And a lot of people are like, yeah, how do I rig the game? I know that there's some secrets out there. How do I do that?
Yeah.
And commandments, I could have called them four assumptions, but commandments feel like this thing that I better do it, because if not, and I violate these commandments, I'm placed into some sort of mortal peril, and I don't want that. So these four commandments, and this is the essence of sort of shifting your mindset. So one, we're always going to bias or emphasize closer over more. Number two, we have to understand the difference, and I'll go back and explain these two, understand the difference between a preference and something that is binary. Number three, understand that there are an infinite number of trade-offs. So we have to always evaluate the trade-offs. And number four is we're always going to bias asymmetric bets. So each of those are kind of technical. I'll break down what they mean really quickly. So more, we're biologically wired through dopamine to chase more. We think more clients is the answer, more revenue is the answer, but it isn't necessarily getting us closer to what we want, because there's more than one currency. There's not just money, there's time, your identity and influence, your energy, your reputation. And so in trying to make more money, you might get further away from what you actually want. And I could give you lots of examples of that. Preference versus binary. Binary is right and wrong. And it's sort of, what would Google do? If you can go ask the question to Google and get a fact-based answer, great. But that's not the reality for most business owners. They're asking preference-based questions. Should you grow your business is a preference. Should you hire your employees is a preference. Should you go and do internet-based marketing, outbound versus inbound? Those are preferences. You can give case studies for businesses that are really successful, that have had very few employees, and some that have lots of employees. So there isn't a right or wrong, it's what you want. In terms of trade-offs, money is a scarce resource. People who are listening to finance, the finance podcast, they understand this. What a lot of people don't understand is when you make a bet, and in business, we make a lot of bets. We just don't call them bets often. When you make a bet, you tie up that resource, that time, money, energy, etc., and you've removed an infinite number of other bets that you could have made. So you have to weigh those trade-offs, and that leads to number four, which is we only want to make bets where we have way more upside than downside. Now, I ran through that, and there's a lot more we could talk about that. But if you subscribe to those four commandments, then you have to rewire a lot of the ways that you think about money and finance.
Yeah. So I think really your approach, what I'm hearing from you, is that you really help, and your approach is centered around really simplicity, making complex financial matters, kind of digestible. Why do you think that so many firms tend to overcomplicate the process, and how do you break it down, for your clients? So, I mean, you just kind of shared some ideas of how you operate. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that there are different definitions, and you kind of are making sure that people are kind of understanding what you're saying and understanding actually what's going to happen, because I think there is often kind of a disconnect where, the financial industry tends to confuse people, hopefully hoping that they're going to buy. If I'm going to use it that way, it's a little bit biased towards maybe the financial advisors. But, so from that perspective, how do you really help clients to understand what it is that they need to be doing, and moving from that place where they're not so focused on just the business, but actually understanding that they need to do planning?
So I think in terms of the best way to help a client when you don't have you have a new relationship, is to sell them what they want, but give them what they need, and do it in this. So I believe that the best type of marketing is people helping people. Let me genuinely support you in the way that I would want to support a family member, my parents, myself. Same way I want a doctor to tell me, hey, you've got this issue. Here's what I would do if I were in your exact situation. So because of the education systems and money beliefs that people have, they're typically coming to a financial advisor for a very specific outcome. Make me more money as fast as possible. I'm in financial distress. Get me out of financial distress. I'm struggling to grow my business. I'm overpaying in tax. These are all things that we help clients with. And so you have to meet people at their individual point of need and then show them what's possible. Because what I'm asking people to do is hard. I sell hard work, right? Unraveling all these money beliefs and thinking differently and having to unlearn is incredibly hard. And so if you present it that way, hey, I'm going to make you unlearn a bunch of stuff and you're going to really have to reflect on what got you in this situation. It's like, can you just help me save on taxes, or can you just help? So it is a process of meeting them where they're at and then introducing these concepts along the way, but tied to a specific outcome. It's like, hey, we start with our clients mapping out their solvable problem and showing them, hey, the thing you thought was going to take 20 years, if we pull these 3 levers, we cut that time in half. Like, oh, really? And when they see that, the goals part of our solvable problem methodology is to optimize before you maximize. What is the number one thing that you want to achieve and fund first? And pretty consistently, once we show them how much time we can cut off, the number one thing they have is not actually their number one thing. They just didn't think that their number 5 thing was possible, or they thought they would be judged for it, or they thought there was a right or wrong. There was a test that we were administering, and they have to say that moving to another country or something that might feel not mainstream. Mainstream would be funding their retirement as quickly as possible. But really, what they want to do is move somewhere else or change jobs. Like, I can't tell you that. You're going to judge me. Like, but now I know what's possible. Okay, now I can be a bit more honest, or a bit more with the advisor, or a bit more honest with themselves. I mean, sometimes they don't genuinely know what they actually want until they see what's possible and give themselves permission. So there's a bit of a breadcrumb approach that you have to take.
Yeah, I think you brought up a point. I think often, in the financial business, the client doesn't really know what they want or what it looks like. And again, there is this perception. And I know when I speak to a lot of advisors, they're kind of like, well, I'm a financial advisor. They'll know how I can help them. I'm like, oh, no, you got to show them. Like you just kind of mentioned, you got to give them breadcrumbs, and you got to kind of emphasize that, there is a process to this thing, and everybody's got to be on the same, on the same page. Now, you emphasize planning for the future rather than looking at historical financial reports. How do you, kind of get business owners to think more forward rather than kind of reacting what has already happened?
Yeah, so what I advocate for in many instances is to be more of an architect building the future versus an archaeologist that's just digging up the past. And I'll give it a tax example. So taxes are future focused. If you want to pay less in tax, you have to modify what you're doing in the future. You may need to document things differently. You may need to invest in some assets. The core tenet of tax planning is to convert income or cash into assets that generate a tax benefit. That's future focused. We may need to entirely recapitalize the business or your personal liquidity to be able to allow you to be in a position to minimize your taxes. That's inherently future focused. And it's no different than, do you want to have a better relationship with your family or friends? You got to probably behave differently. If you want to get jacked and have 10% body fat, you got to behave differently. You got to eat, change your diet, change your workout routine. That's all future focused. There's some benefit to understanding your current position. So I'm not someone who's like, let's ignore the past. We have to understand our current position to be able to measure how where we're at and what is necessary to get to our final point of view. But too many advisors say this month, and they're talking about last month. So, and they're talking about this month on March 26th, and they're talking about something that happened in February, or they're talking about this year, and they're talking about this year in 2025, but they're referring to 2024. So timeliness, I have this acronym that I developed with this guy named Steve Loudon, who was my mentor for a little bit when I was in a financial analysis type role. He went on to become CFO of Roku and take them public and do some really cool stuff. And he used to talk about when in every report that we put together, it needs to provide business insight that's relevant and digestible. He didn't always say it in that order. So my contribution was to put it in that order and make called the BIRD principle, business insight that's relevant and digestible. Relevancy is what I'm talking about. So when you're getting information that's 45 days in the past, 12 months in the past, it's no longer relevant. And there's no point in looking at data if it's not going to modify your behavior. So data, the intention of looking at and analyzing data is to determine how it should modify your behavior. But if it's not going to modify it, then why are we looking at it? If anything, there's a bigger risk that it creates anxiety for you.
Yeah, you're bringing a good point, and I think it really comes down to, I think that as aside from what you just mentioned, also the financial world is full of noise and complexity, right? So how do you really help your clients to cut through all of that noise? How do you help them to really focus on the strategies that actually matter? And like you just mentioned, looking at some statements from 12 months ago, are they even relevant to the current situation?
Yeah, so we have in my book, I talk about these different frames, and they're like glasses that we're putting on to have a different perspective. And I want people to think about it in this literal sense of I'm putting on these glasses as a way to sharpen your intent and to try to, it's like when you change into your workout gear. It's like, okay, I put on my shoes. I'm ready. I got a little bit of extra energy. I'm in the gear now. So same thing. And there's some frames that I teach. One of them is called the investor frame. And the idea is to look at a bet, a thing that you've done, and ask yourself the question, based off what I know today, would I invest in this thing again? I'm not just talking about stocks and bonds. I'm talking about an employee you hired. I'm talking about a marketing agency that you hired. These are all bets. Your business didn't require you to do it. You made a bet that hiring this employee would make you more profitable, grow your revenue, save you time. You made a bet that hiring this marketing agency was going to have some result. So is it, based off what you know today, would you invest in it again? If yes, end of discussion. If no, or not sure, or maybe, then what would have to be true to turn that from a no to a yes? And then based off what would have to be true, then you have to ask yourself the question, am I willing to do that? And what are the terms? So I advocate for setting rules in advance and requiring what I call preponderance of data. Oftentimes we see a quick article, an anecdote, and that's all the data that we intake, but it's not a preponderance of data. It's not fully substantiated. And it might not be the entire story. So do I have a preponderance of data? Oftentimes the answer is no. Small business owners they can't tell me if they're getting an ROI on a bet that they've made. They don't have the data, or they haven't tracked the data, or they don't know how to get access to it. So that just tells us that we can have a bit more discipline, set the criteria better in advance, and ultimately recognize that as humans, we're biased. And we are going to, and those of you who deny that are those who are going to suffer the most consequences generally, because you'll stay in losing investments longer. That's called loss aversion. You'll be subject to ownership bias. You value your neighbor's home more than you value your own home, but you also value your ideas more than someone else's ideas. So you'll stay in a bet longer because it was your idea. And these all don't serve you in living the life that you want with the least amount of effort, the least amount of risk. So I could go on with other examples of principles, but what we ultimately need is a toolkit that we can utilize to consistency over accuracy, consistently examine problems and come up with the best solution, and then recover when we made the wrong decision as fast as possible.
Yeah, you were talking about risk, and I know one of the core messages that you talk about is really navigating risk while making money on your own terms. What's the one common mistakes that you see that the business owners make while they're trying to manage their risk?
They think that they need to go all in, that the only way to be successful is if they quote unquote burn the boats and go all in. There's not a lot of evidence to support that success is positively correlated to going all in. There's just as many examples, if not more, of people going bankrupt from that approach as people who have had financial success. There is a lot of evidence. Look at the billionaires who they're billionaires because they made bets where there was asymmetry, way more upside than downside. Maybe it's a market opportunity, or maybe they're naturally good at removing downside risk or in hedging derivatives. How can I remove the bad stuff, or how can I lock in a gain? So if you remove all the downside, you're only left with upside. So the big mistake is to think that success is tied to going all in. That's not necessarily true. And to not think about in the front end, how can I eliminate all the bad stuff so I'm only left with good opportunities?
Yeah. Now, I know a lot of your work is really helping business owners align, their decision with their personal values and goals. That's kind of what we're talking about. How do you guide them through that whole process? Because it is about mindset. That's really what we're talking about, and the way that people think. So what is kind of the, how do you guide them through that process?
Yeah, there's that Sun Tzu saying about know yourself, know your enemy, and know yourself, know your enemy, and you can fight 100 battles without peril. And the knowing yourself is incredibly challenging, because if I ask somebody, and there's something I write about in the book called Playing Your Game, what is your default tendencies? Because again, there's a lot of evidence for people who have had excessive results that they were eccentric before they were a billionaire. It's like now they just get labeled eccentric. They were just called weird before that. So there is a lot of evidence to say that leaning into your default strengths are positively correlated with success. But most of us don't know how to answer what is my game. So I have an exercise in the book that I take people through, and have done this a number of times live, where I ask people to think about their favorite sport or hobby growing up. How did you show up? What did you like about it? And I have found that favorite sport or hobby is also how they would most like to play business. And so thinking about those characteristics. So for me, basketball is my default sport. And I was always the taller kid, but really wanted to be the shooting guard. I wanted the ball in my hands, wanted to take the last shot, and but not the most athletically gifted. So I had to hustle. And that's how I like to play in business. I'm not afraid to take the last shot. I want the ball in my hands, and I like to hustle. Uh, so that's sort of when I'm the happiest in business, but also it creates downside risk. Sometimes I'm hustling too much. Sometimes I'm taking too many shots. Sometimes you gotta just pass the ball. So you can use that same sort of exercise, favorite sport or hobby, digging into the characteristics to try to figure out your default strengths. And then just know that this is not something that you solve in 5 minutes. Who am I? And you don't really go from I don't know to I know. And you also have to acknowledge that life is an infinite game. So what you think you want today is not necessarily what you want 5 years from now. So just recognize the fact that who you are and what you want is a moving target. And that's okay. That's actually expected.
Yeah. Now, your book, really challenges the conventional wisdom, and you already kind of talked about the one myth, which is, that business owners don't have to go all in. Is there another financial myth that you find yourself kind of debunking, or most often when you talk to business owners?
Oh gosh, so many of them. But the the biggest myth is that is around passive investments. or at least the way that most people construct their passive portfolio, which is like, I want to make some money, but really, I want to, I want to divorce myself from the financial decision-making side of things. Like I want to have an advisor handle that, or I want to have a CPA handle that. And I just, I'm the visionary. So I just want to do visionary stuff. And I'm going to put all this stuff, all my funds into these passive investments, real estate, or funds that are managed by different investors. And then they don't get the results they want. And that's because every business decision is a financial decision. So you don't just get to separate the two. And even if an investment eventually becomes passive, there's a lot of upfront work to get to that point. Buying a property takes a lot of work to find the right property, find the right person to manage it. And there's still some ongoing oversight. So I just remind people, every business decision is a financial decision. You still have to set the rules in advance, get sufficient data, play your game, know where your weaknesses are, know your kind of your defaults. So I should have mentioned this earlier, but I created this thing called the 5 wealth types. That's before I knew someone was putting out a New York Times bestseller a few weeks ago called the 5 wealth types. It's a totally different approach. But anyone can go to wealthtype.com and spend about 3 minutes, and it's going to tell you if you're a hustler, a gambler, a optimizer, a saver, or an outsourcer. And then based off that, it's going to tell you what your strengths are and what your likely weaknesses are, ways that you would blow yourself up. And so understanding that helps you put in some of those guardrails and get back to the idea that every business decision, but maybe every decision, is a financial.
Yeah, you do bring a good point. Now, from reading and going over your book and talking to you, I see that you have a very systematic way of doing things. Now, when it comes down to the onboarding process to build a financial certainty roadmap, what is the kind of the one surprising insight that clients typically discover going through that process?
That they can fund their goals in half the amount of time that they expected with less effort and less risk, because they're leaving a bunch of money on the table, both oftentimes in tax optimization, but even more so, we have an exercise called cash flow engineering, where we go through all their expenses and we categorize them as a core expense versus a non-core expense. And the non-core expense is a bet. A core expense, these are my terms, is an expense that the business requires to operate. You have to have a tax business has to have tax software, right? It's got to utilize it. But what I find is that a lot of the expenses are non-core. It's a bet. And so when we ask them to provide us with data to show, so we can calculate the ROI, there's often no data. Or when we look at the ROI across all their different bets, most of them are performing at less than a 10% return. Now, why do I say 10%? Because that's roughly what you could get if you put it into an S&P 500 index fund. So we've made all these bets that require a ton of effort and stress, and we would have gotten a slightly better return if we just put it into the S&P 500, which is about as low effort as you can get, right? And even worse is that you need a 40% return on your bets to fund your solvable problem in the timeline that you set. So every bet in your business that's under 10% is way too much effort, because just put that in the S&P 500 if that's where you do. But even worse, everything below the return you need for your solvable problem is getting you further away. So let's recapture those resources using the investor frame and then reallocate them to better bets that have more asymmetry. Now, we're not going to win every time on that. So we got to keep going through that process on a regular basis, similar to what we would do with our stocks. So it's actually called the mental accounting bias, is the technical term. If we label something as an investment, we scrutinize it much differently than if it's an expense. So business owners have a bunch of investments that they've labeled as expenses, but they're not assessing for a rate of return. And if they were, they would cancel a lot of those and move them into a different position.
You bring a great point again. It's reviewing what you have and why did you do it. Now, you're passionate about helping clients achieve long-term growth. What's one of the most rewarding transformation that you've seen in the work that you do with business owners?
When they realize that the biggest risk in life is not living the life that they want,
Mm,
and they take control of their preferences, what they actually want. And again, I work with a lot of folks who are like me, who are recovering people pleasers, who are used to getting good grades or degrees or moving up into the next job or next. And along the way, in everything that they've done, at least career and business, is that they think there's a test coming. Now they don't consciously think that, but they're like, there's a right and wrong way to do this, right? And so just tell me the right way so that I can do this and get an A on the paper. It's like when it's your business, you're the commissioner. I call it the commissioner frame. You get to write the rules of the game that you're playing. Now the market may not like all of those rules, but you get to write them. Uh, and most of the questions you're asking are preferences. So you already have the answers to most of your questions. Now, again, for those people who are like me, who are recovering, people pleasing, got to get the right grade, at first that creates a lot of anxiety for them. It's like, what does it mean if there's not a right and a wrong? But once they get to the other side of that, they have so much more freedom and they're not burdened by doing it the right way and ending up in a position where by trying to do things the right way, they become exploitable. Because if you think there's a right way, then someone, if they sell it to you good enough, sell you on this three steps to being a multimillionaire, like in a position of desperation. Like, I got to get this right. You keep making all these bets to get it right when you already have all the answers.
mm. Now, listen, financial certainty sounds great in theory, but what's the one actionable step that, business owners can take today to really start moving closer to achieving that goal?
Yeah, defining what your definition of financial certainty is, going through that solvable problem tool. I have a book out called The Solvable Problem that has my methodology in it and 8 other case studies from experts in their field, as well as the chapter in my book, Rigging the Game. But until you get clear on what you want and you put that in an order of the highest priority to the lowest priority and you weight it, meaning how much more important is the top priority than the second priority on your list, et cetera. Until you're clear on that, no one can really effectively help you. You can't solve a strategic problem with tactics. There's no amount of things that I can give you tactically that are going to help you if we don't have the right strategy, if we're not actually optimizing for your definition of wealth. I could show you a bunch of things, but if your number one priority is to work 10 hours a week so you can spend more time with your kids, and I give you a bunch of strategies that help you grow your wealth, but you're working 80 hours a week, I got you further away. That tactic didn't help you. You got further away from your definition of financial certainty. So have to get clear there first. Otherwise, you're just getting a bunch of tactics.
Yeah, you bring out a great point. Yeah. Now, looking ahead for the next 5 to 10 years, what's your long-term vision for Nth Degree CPAs, and how do you see your work evolving to continue kind of serving clients at a much higher level?
Yeah, so our focus primarily up to this point has been on implementing these strategies for clients, but increasingly we're moving into the teaching and guiding.
Mm,
So we're expanding access to our intellectual property that has been up to this point limited to a few courses that I've put out and books that I've written. But we're going to increasingly give access to our intellectual property through some agentic employees that we're building. So some not quite bots, but AI tools that can enable folks to be able to work through things like the solvable problem and call upon the right principles to help them process issues consistently, and some licensing of our intellectual property to other financial service providers who want to, for example, help their clients understand their wealth types, or sales organizations who want to understand their prospects' wealth type. Because if you know a client is a gambler, that's a much different sales talk track than someone who's a outsourcer. The outsourcer wants a lot of evidence and credibility from third parties and testimonials. The gambler wants to know that they're not going to have to put in a whole lot of effort, but they're going to get an outcome quickly, and they're going to get a bunch of dopamine from it.
No, I think knowing who kind of where you fit in, those are really great tools for somebody to have. Dan, this has been a great and fascinating conversation. If our listeners want to learn more about you and the work that you do, and essentially possibly connect directly with you, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Yeah, the best way would be to go to my CPA firm's website, nth-degree-cpas.com. It's just NTH Degree CPAs. There's an S at the end. And there's a link there to sign up for my newsletter and chat with someone on my team, get access to copies of my book and other programs and events that we have.
That's great. Dan, this has been an insightful conversation. Your approach to financial certainty and your dedication to really simplifying the complex strategies is impressive. Thank you for sharing your insights today.
Yeah, really appreciate the thoughtful questions and having me on. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Finance Leaders Podcast for more conversations from top industry professionals. Until next time, take care and keep building your financial future on solid principles.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Finance Leaders Retirement Insights.